Once we know the names of the 66 books of the Bible, we can start to consider where they belong. Before we proceed, you really do need to be confident that you know the names of the 66 books in the correct order. If you've not yet got there, please turn off this recording and do not restart until you have learnt them. Use the first lesson to remind you. Our English word Bible came to us through a French word that was derived from the Latin biblia, which in turn came from the Greek biblia, meaning books, plural. The singular, book, is biblos, which comes from the word bublos, papyrus, which is named after the Phoenician city Byblos, modern Jubail, which was an important centre for the export of papyrus. The Bible is divided into two unequal halves, called testaments. The Old Testament, with 39 books, is much longer than the New, which has 27. The word testament means covenant, a contract or agreement. So the Old Testament is a record of God's agreements with his chosen people, the Jews. He made agreements with the ancestors of the Jewish people, the men sometimes called patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. We meet these men in the first book of the Old Testament, Genesis. And then God made an agreement with the descendants of Abraham at Mount Sinai. This was given to Moses and is often called the Law of Moses. But of course the law came from God. It was given to Moses and he told the people. This is recorded in the second book of the Old Testament, Exodus, and further details are given in Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy. The rest of the Old Testament records how God kept his side of the agreement and how the chosen people repeatedly did not. And the Old Testament also looks forward to a better agreement, one between God and all humanity, a covenant sealed by the blood of his Son, Jesus, a New Testament. So the Old Testament is the holy book of the Jewish people, and one used by Christians as well. The New Testament is the holy book of the Church, and Muslims also regard the Bible as a holy book, although they believe it has been corrupted and is therefore inferior to the Quran. There is another collection of ancient books that is found in some copies of the Bible. This is the Apocrypha, sometimes known as the Deuterocanonical books. Apocrypha comes from a Greek word meaning hidden. They are ancient books and very interesting to read, but they were never part of the original Old Testament. Some may have been written in Hebrew, but all were collected in their Greek form, and they were included in the great Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, called the Septuagint. The word Septuagint refers to the 70 translators who were believed to have made the translation. When the scholar and translator Jerome was working on his Latin Bible for the people, called the Vulgate, it was the Septuagint that he used for the Old Testament. So the Vulgate Bible included these extra books. And when you look at a Roman Catholic Bible that follows in the tradition of the Vulgate, you will see that there are more books in their Old Testament. Most Protestant Bibles either omit the books of the Apocrypha entirely or group them together between the Testaments. Often the designation will be deuterocanonical rather than Apocrypha. The books are no longer hidden, so Apocrypha is perhaps no longer the best title. But neither were the books part of the Hebrew Bible, so they are a later addition to the canon or deuterocanonical. For now, we will concentrate on the Hebrew Old Testament. The first 5 books are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy. In Hebrew, these are called the Torah, the law. Jews sometimes refer to these books as Hamisa Humse HaTorah, the 5/5 of the Torah. This phrase in Greek is He Pentateuchos Biblos, the fivefold book, from which we get the word Pentateuch, the preferred designation in academic usage. The Pentateuch takes us from the creation in Genesis chapter 1 to the death of Moses in Deuteronomy 34. According to tradition, it was Moses who wrote the Pentateuch, hence another descriptive title, the Books of Moses, or the Law of Moses. However, the death of Moses presents a slight difficulty. How could Moses record an account of his own death? Either God told him, and Moses wrote it down prophetically before it happened, or someone finished the story after the event, Joshua being a likely person to do this. Don't worry too much about this now. It is an important question, and one that will be dealt with elsewhere. The Jewish scriptures and the Christian Old Testament are in agreement over the first 5 books. But the way the remaining 34 books are arranged and classified differ between the two faiths. The content remains the same, but the order is different. We will start with the Christian arrangement, as this is more likely to be familiar to you and you can follow in your own Old Testament. We will look at the Hebrew order a little later. After the 5 books of Moses come 12 books of history. Now, that is not to suggest that there is no historical data to be found in the Torah, but it is to say that the type of history contained in Torah is different. Most of the stories in Genesis, for example, are closer to biography than history. Biography is a type of history, but it is more personal. The history of an individual life. In Greek, bios is life, as in biology, and grapho means to write. So biography is writing about a life, and autobiography is writing about your own life. So the stories in Genesis are about individuals, Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham and his family, and so on. And one could argue that Exodus through to Deuteronomy is the story of Moses, although these books also tell of the birth of the nation of Israel. It is never a good idea to try to force ancient documents to conform to modern definitions. If we were to write a history of Israel or a biography of Moses today in the 21st century, we would follow the conventions of our society and write the story differently to how it was written all those centuries ago. As the novelist L.P. Hartley observed, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." You will look at this in more detail later on. For now, we are revising the names of the books and putting them into the correct categories. So, there are 12 books of history, arranged in chronological order. Joshua led the people after the death of Moses. They crossed the Jordan, fought the Battle of Jericho, where the walls came a-tumbling down, and started to occupy the promised land. After Joshua, there was a time when there was no king, and the people were led by judges. Hence the next book, Judges. And during the time of the judges lived a woman named Ruth. Her story is recorded in the shortest of the historical books, the Book of Ruth. Then we meet one of the greatest men in the Bible, Samuel. Perhaps the last judge, certainly one of the greatest prophets. His story is found in 1 Samuel. And the impact of Samuel on the establishment of the monarchy is recorded in 2 Samuel. The first 3 kings of Israel were Saul, David and Solomon. After the death of Solomon, the kingdom divided. The southern tribes were dominated by Judah. The northern tribes took the name of the patriarch, Israel. The 2 histories are recorded in parallel in 1 and 2 Kings, and retold in more detail and concentrating on the southern kingdom of Judah in 1 and 2 Chronicles. The northern kingdom fell into apostasy. Idols were worshipped and the law of Moses forgotten. God sent prophets to warn the people, but they did not listen. And so God sent the Assyrians to destroy them. And in late 722 or early 721 BC, the northern kingdom came to an end, and the northern tribes were taken into the Assyrian Empire and never heard of again. The southern kingdom was not quite as bad as the northern kingdom, but eventually God had to act, and in 586 BC the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. Many Jews were deported to Babylon, where they were allowed to settle in Jewish communities in exile. And when the Persians conquered Babylon, the Jews were allowed home, led by Ezra and Nehemiah, as recorded in the books bearing their names. Meanwhile, in the Persian city of Susa, there lived a beautiful Jewish girl named Esther. The amazing story of how this one girl saved the Jewish nation from destruction is recorded in the book of Esther. And at this point, Jewish history comes to an end. No, not really. But from this point onwards, the history of the Jewish people is found in other writings, in the prophets, and in other books that are not included within the pages of the Old Testament. After the 12 books of history, we have 5 books of poetry, Hebrew poetry. So do not expect the rhythm and rhyme that we find in English poetry. But your Bible should indicate in some way that these are poems, probably by setting the type differently. The books are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Our next section of the Old Testament again comprises 5 books. These are the major prophets. Major here meaning longer when compared with the shorter minor prophets. They are arranged in chronological order, although there is a certain amount of overlap. Isaiah comes first. He was called to be a prophet in the year that King Uzziah died. This equates to 740 or 739 BC. His last datable appearance in the historical record was during a campaign by the Assyrian king Sennacherib in 701 BC. There is a tradition, so we can take it or leave it, that Isaiah was murdered by King Manasseh. Jeremiah was called to be a prophet in the 13th year of King Josiah of Judah, that is 626 BC to us, and he lived to see Jerusalem fall to the Babylonians in 587 BC. Having seen the city and temple destroyed, Jeremiah was moved to lament over what had happened. These lamentations follow the book of Jeremiah and are counted as one of the 5 major prophets, although to be strictly accurate, Lamentations is really Jeremiah part 2. So we have Isaiah, Jeremiah and Lamentations. The 3rd major prophet, or the 4th book if you prefer, is Ezekiel. He saw a wheel way up in the middle of the air, and much more besides. As a young man, he was taken captive by the Babylonians and was living in exile when Jerusalem fell. His call to be a prophet came in the 4th month of the 5th year of the captivity, and he served for some 20 years. During this time he may well have met Jeremiah and Daniel. Daniel is the last of the major prophets. Like Ezekiel, he was taken away from Judah by the Babylonians and was already living in exile when Jerusalem was destroyed. Daniel was a prophet in exile for about 75 years and outlived the Babylonian Empire, seeing the Persians take control. After the 5 major prophets, we have the section that most Bible students find most challenging to memorize, the 12 minor or shorter prophets. Go on, test yourself. Stop this presentation and make sure you know the 12 in the correct order. The 12 minor prophets cover both the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel, as well as speaking to the Jewish people after the exile. Indeed, some of the 12 have a message for Gentiles in the neighbouring kingdoms. In brief, we have Hosea, who spoke to the people of the northern kingdom during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz and Hezekiah in Judah, and Jeroboam II in Israel. That is much of the 7th century before Christ. After Hosea is Joel. Joel is a common name in the Old Testament, and there is little within the book to give us a date. The main event is a plague of locusts, but this is not so uncommon as to be much help. His message is directed to the southern kingdom, but he looks forward to the pouring out of God's Spirit that occurred on the day of Pentecost. Amos was from the southern kingdom, but was sent north to Israel during the reign of Jeroboam II in the middle years of the 8th century BC. Obadiah is the shortest of the books of the Old Testament. He condemns the neighbours of Judah, the Edomites, for plundering God's people in Judah. The Edomites were habitual raiders, and so the message and ministry of Obadiah can be placed in several different historical periods. Don't worry about this for now. Next comes the most famous of the minor prophets, Jonah, who lived in a whale. Well, not quite. You will look at Jonah and his whale later. For now, you need to know that he was from the northern kingdom and lived at the time of King Jeroboam II in the 8th century BC. But Jonah's message was for the hated Assyrians, not for the Israelites, as you will see later. After Jonah comes Micah. Micah was a Judahite and lived at the same time as Isaiah and Hosea in the latter half of the 8th century BC. He has messages for both Judah and Israel. Nahum was from El-Kosh, an unidentified town in Judah. He was a contemporary of Jeremiah, Habakkuk and Zephaniah. This places Nahum in the second half of the 6th century BC. His message is directed to Nineveh, the chief city of Assyria. As Nineveh fell in 612 BC, Nahum must have been active not long before this date. Habakkuk questions God. Habakkuk was living in Judah not long before the Babylonians invaded. That makes him a contemporary of Jeremiah's towards the end of the 7th century BC. Why, asks Habakkuk, is God using the wicked Babylonians to punish the chosen people? Zephaniah is one of the last of the prophets in Judah prior to the Babylonian captivity. He lived in Jerusalem and wrote during the reign of King Josiah. That gives us a date of around 625 BC. Now there is a gap. Haggai may have lived in Jerusalem before the Babylonians destroyed the city in 587 BC, or he may have been born in exile. What is certain is that he returned to Jerusalem with Zechariah and urged the people to rebuild the temple. His ministry lasted for 4 months in 520 BC. Like Haggai, Zechariah travelled from Babylon to Jerusalem and was involved in the rebuilding of the city and temple in 520 BC. And finally, we have Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, although by no means the last Jewish prophet. We meet plenty of Jewish prophets in the New Testament. According to Jewish tradition, Malachi came after Haggai and Zechariah. This would make Malachi a contemporary of Nehemiah in the 5th century BC. And here endeth the Old Testament. Before we reach the New Testament, it is worth pointing out that the Jews arrange their scriptures differently to what I've been telling you. Same books, but the total is different and the order is different too. The first 5 books, the Torah, are the same: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So no problems there. Next we have the prophets, the Nevi'im in Hebrew. First we have the former or earlier prophets, Nevi'im Risonim, Joshua, Judges, Samuel and Kings. Note that Ruth comes later, and note that in Hebrew Samuel and Kings are not divided into first and second. After the former prophets come, surprise, surprise, the latter or later prophets, Nevi'im Achoranim, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel and the Book of the 12. No Lamentations and no Daniel, they come later. And note that the 12 prophets are listed as one single book. No problems in memorising them this way. The writings, Ketuvim, make up the rest. First come Psalms, Proverbs and Job. Note the change in order from our Old Testament where Job comes first. Then we get the 5 scrolls, known as the Megillot: Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes and Esther. And finally we get Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, which is 1 book, and Chronicles, again 1 book. With the 12 prophets counted as 1 book, and Ezra and Nehemiah being joined to make 1, and the 3 first and seconds not being split into 2, we can see how the Hebrew total differs from the Christian 39 while still having exactly the same content. Don't worry too much about the Hebrew order, but be aware that the Christian and Hebrew order and categories are different. And of course we do not have this problem when we reach the New Testament, as this has never been a part of the Hebrew Scriptures. You should know the 27 books of the New Testament in the correct order by now. If you do not, I cannot stress enough how important it is to get this done. So, go and do it. For those of you who are confident in this, we will take a quick run through. 4 Gospels to start, Matthew, Mark and Luke being the synoptic, the seen together Gospels, followed by John's different view. Then we have Luke part 2, the book of Acts, 4 biographies and 1 history. Next come the letters, 22 of them. We start with Paul's letters to churches: Romans, Corinthians, 1st and 2nd, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians and 2 to the Thessalonians. Next we have Paul's letters to individuals: Timothy, who gets 2, Titus and Philemon, and then the letter to the Hebrews. This might be by Paul or it might not, but it is certainly a letter to the Hebrews, not from them. All the other letters are named for the writers: James, Peter, who wrote 2, John, who wrote 3 and so gives us the only 3rd in the Bible, and Jude. All apostles or closely connected to the apostles. And finally, we get the most unusual book in the New Testament, Revelation. Part letter, there are 7 letters to the churches in the opening chapters, and part vision, an apocalypse, so placed in a category all of its own. Unless we collect it with John's other writings, the Gospel and the 3 letters, but we will not discuss this any further in this session. All we need now is to note abbreviations. An abbreviation is when a word is cut short. This will be marked by a full stop, also known as a point, at the end. So Genesis is abbreviated to Gen, capital G-E-N, point. Contractions are where the middle is removed. The contraction should be marked with an apostrophe, so John becomes Jn, no point unless it's at the end of a sentence. However, contractions are now rarely used other than when reporting colloquial speech, so we shall say no more about them. So far as books of the Bible go, contractions are treated as abbreviations, so John becomes Jn, capital J-N, point. If you are not sure about abbreviations, do not use them. They are never used in spoken English other than for very well-known examples, such as the British Broadcasting Corporation, which is always the BBC, even in formal English. But books of the Bible are not abbreviated in spoken English. Neither are proper names shortened. Joshua, the man, is never, ever Josh. Likewise, books are not abbreviated in formal written English. So, when you write a term paper, you write the names in full. In your personal notebooks, you may abbreviate. These notes are for your own use. However, beware of confusions. Which book is Joe? J-O. Think about it. Could Joe refer to Joshua, Job, Joel, Jonah, or John? Also, be consistent. If you abbreviate Deuteronomy as Deut, capital D, EUT point, then DUT it must remain. You should not switch to DUT, capital D, T point. The only places for these abbreviations are in parentheses to give references within your text, or as footnotes to give them at the bottom of the page. So, for example, you are writing about the miracles of Jesus and you write the following. Jesus performed many miracles. John, John, records the first, water into wine at Cana. Open brackets. JN.2:1 close brackets. Only one miracle is reported by all four gospel writers, the feeding of the 5,000. Open brackets, capital MT point 1:4:13-21 semicolon, capital MK point 6 colon, and so on through to JN.6, and we can close the brackets. Spoken like this, it sounds very complicated. All you have said is, Jesus performed many miracles. John records the first, water into wine at Cana. Only one miracle is reported in all four Gospels, the feeding of the 5,000. And then you give the references, book, chapter and verse. You could hide them in parentheses in the text, or drop them to the bottom of the page in footnotes, so long as somewhere or other you have backed up your statements with the references. It doesn't matter where they are. If you are unsure about abbreviations, it is best not to use them, but watch how they are used in the books that you are reading and have a go yourself when you are ready. In the meantime, keep practicing those books of the Bible. Thank you.